My professor and mentor in seminary, Dr. Ibrahim Farajajeh, was a giant of a person. Physically, he stood at maybe 6'7" tall. He was a massive presence with long and thick dreadlocks in his younger life and a long orange beard in his later life when I knew him. Spiritually, he was a giant, a black queer man raised in the Bay Area who later became a spiritual leader in the Russian Orthodox faith and the Jewish faith and a sheikh in the Chishti Sufi tradition of Islam, not to mention a professor and provost at one of our Unitarian Universalist seminaries for several decades. Intellectually, he was a giant. He was fluent in something like 15 languages and just regretted that he couldn't really get Farsi down. He could converse for hours and hours on just about any philosopher or theologian or artist. His life demonstrated a boundless ability to hold multiple truths together. There was a largeness about him that was somehow able to hold it all: languages, ideas, religions, relationships. But one of the most remarkable things about him was his heart, was his incredible ability to express joy and love alongside his forceful work against oppression, against Islamophobia and homophobia and racism and transphobia and injustice of all kinds. His heart was what was most remarkable, because he lifted his voice against oppression again and again, despite attacks on his professional life and his relationships, despite death threats, despite ceaselessly being stopped and questioned in security lines at airports. He used his rage to fight for justice over his many decades in activism and in intellectual life, religious leadership. And he loved life. He loved music, gamely saying yes to singing the bass line whenever I would try to recruit him for small ensembles for our seminary's Tuesday chapel services. When we would mess up in rehearsals, the deep bass of his voice would give way to this ebullient, high-pitched laughter, a laugh that you could hear all the way across the building. He loved children. He would welcome children into his classes, treating them just like any other student. He would hold the babies of his students in his giant hands and make them giggle. He loved cats. He would tell me stories about kittens he had found in some cities that he had lived, how he had carried them home through the rain. He helped name my beloved cat, Hildegard. And he loved Shonda Rhimes, and he loved RuPaul's Drag Race. I don't know where he found the time to watch TV amongst everything else that he did, but he had that about him as well. The greats can powerfully hold both rage and delight, my friend and colleague, Reverend Sherry Halliday Kwan, said to me recently. The greats can powerfully hold both rage and delight. Dr. Farajajeh, or Baba, is what we called him, many of his students called him, was one of these greats, was one of the greats that I had the honor of learning from as I prepared for ministry. Reverend Dr. James Cone, who's credited as the founder of Black theology and was a professor at Union Theological Seminary, where Sherry went and where Reverend Hannah went, was another one. The author of the books Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism, Adrienne Marie Brown, is the third one. Many of the greats can powerfully hold both rage and delight. And although great prophets and great spiritual leaders and justice leaders throughout time are often known more for their ability to speak to one of those than the other, most of them who show me the way how best to be human are somehow able to travel into those deep valleys and up those high peaks of human experience. Those who study the human psyche, from psychologists to spiritual leaders, will tell you that you can't only live life in the realm of joy, right? I wish I could tell you otherwise, but none of us can. No one is joyful all the time. No one can only experience delight and love and peace. We are all forced to face into the depths of tragedy and pain and cruelty over the course of our lives, as well as, hopefully, the heights of joy. And what we know is that if we dull ourselves to our lowest experiences, we are cutting ourselves off from experiencing the high experiences as well. Theologian Friedrich Buechner writes, "The trouble with steeling yourself against the harshness of reality is that the same steel that secures your life against being destroyed secures your life also against being opened up and transformed by the holy power that life itself comes from. The same steel that secures your life from being destroyed also steels you against being opened up and transformed." And to be fair, we know that we do sometimes have to steel ourselves, right? We sometimes have to steel ourselves against the harshness of reality. In the midst of trauma and many steps along the way to healing from trauma, we often dissociate or separate ourselves from those painful emotional experiences just to be able to cope. And so when I speak about these deep valleys and these high peaks, about the gifts of being able to feel fully that which is horrible and that which is also transcendent, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that we should somehow always, every moment, be fully present to trauma. And I don't think that all of us who wrestle with mental illness should go off our meds. This is not a sermon saying that. Facing into the truth of human experience is different than allowing our mental illnesses to subsume us or hijack our lives into devastating swings of mania and depression. That's not what this is about. It's important to take breaks from reliving trauma. It's important to find ways to feel like our lives are our own, including treatment for mental health. The steeling ourselves against the harshness of reality, or the dulling ourselves to difficult experiences that I'm talking about, is the kind that happens because we're trying above all else to be nice. Maybe above our commitment to truth comes our commitment to being nice. Or when we're trying desperately to be serious and feel like we can't show our delight. Or when we have the privilege of turning away from the harshness of reality because it makes us feel uncomfortable. Sometimes those of us with the privilege of turning away will find ourselves even minimizing other people's agony simply because it feels too painful for us to witness. And so we find that armoring ourselves against our own pain or turning away from witnessing the worst cruelty from humanity keeps us from being able to experience that incandescent joy. It can separate us also from the pain of those whose suffering we would like to help relieve. Sometimes it even doubles their pain by denying its reality. Does this idea resonate with you, First Unitarian? The cutting yourself off to the lows of life cuts you off to the highs of life. The turning away from another's lows makes you feel less able to help them out of that low place. Does anyone here feel like they're good at experiencing either rage or delight, but not both? I know I am. I'll say that intellectually it all makes sense to me. I get it in my brain, and I've long tried to make the space in my heart to really feel my difficult feelings so that I can live my life more fully. It's been important to me for a long time to actually try to face in, to bear witness to the most horrific experiences of oppression that my fellow humans experience. It has always been imperfect, everything I've tried to do, but it has been intentional for me for a long time. And it's all gotten a lot harder since I had children. Because facing into the worst of humanity for me, and in particular, facing into the suffering of children and the death of children, takes my breath away, and it sends my inner world spiraling into a kind of mama anxiety that's unlike any anxiety I'd ever felt before. Being a mother makes me see now that every person is somebody's baby. Even the oldest person among us is somebody's baby. And so the suffering and death of adults can sometimes even continue to knock me off kilter. And yet sometimes we encounter the worst of humanity with such concentrated force that it immobilizes us. It forces us to stop short. It makes us desperate to turn away, to run or hide or submerge ourselves in addiction or distraction. And I'm talking about the killing of children in Gaza. I'm talking about the pictures of tiny, lifeless bodies covered in the gray dust of exploded buildings that's all over my Instagram feed as their parents cling to them and weep. I'm talking about how easily it seems for dictators to hold on to their power, even in this day and age, through imprisoning and killing their political opponents, arresting those even just seeking to mourn, like what is happening in Russia this weekend. I'm talking about the leaden hopelessness that drops into so many of our stomachs when we look at how the presidential race is shaping up in our own country this year. If we are not enraged, my friends, we are not paying attention. If we are not enraged, we are failing each other. If we are not enraged, we are out of touch with our very humanity. But here is what some of these greats show us, these prophets, these spiritual leaders, those who show us how best to be human. They show us that if we are not also delighted, we are not paying attention. If we are not also finding joy, we are lying to ourselves. If we're not experiencing love, we're failing each other. If we're not in touch with beauty, we are out of touch with our very humanity. Because despite oppression and violence, despite the rise of authoritarianism and the deterioration of the social safety net, my toddler learned the pleasure of licking a freshly fallen snowdrift yesterday. And despite the horrors in the news, my old lady cat, Teacup, still curled up by my side while I wrote this sermon, and she purred when I rubbed her belly, and she nuzzled into me when I patted her head. And despite the ache that sometimes comes to my back and my legs, my 8-month-old baby's face will always light up with an unconstrained happiness when I put her in her little doorway string and she begins to jump. And Grace and UJ, congregants here who were born 13,000 miles apart on literally opposite ends of the globe, found each other, found love, and are recognized in this day and age in their communities, in their families, and in our state. If we're not paying attention to the world, then we feel neither rage nor delight. My dear friend and colleague, who is now the president of the Unitarian Universalist denomination, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, once told me about a class that she took in her doctoral program. She was studying with the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, a womanist scholar, one of the leaders in womanist theology. And they were studying slave narratives. Each week they were reading stories by slaves of what they had experienced in slavery. Incredibly, incredibly horrific experiences. And so Dr. Cannon assigned the students not only reading facing into that most horrific time, she also assigned them a daily practice of beauty. To survive the work that they had to do to face into the horror, she assigned them a daily practice of beauty. And Sophia is a spinner. Her home is packed with beautiful skeins of multicolored wools and silks. And she's just on a day-to-day basis would spin that wool, that silk, into yarn, taking the soft, richly pigmented fibers that would soften her hands as they flowed through them onto her spinning wheel. She turned the gift of the lamb into something beautiful, something useful, something that could keep a loved one warm, something that could brighten someone's day in order to survive reading in to the atrocities of slavery, the atrocities experienced by her ancestors and so many of ours here. And so as she read stories of whippings and assaults, of kids being separated from parents and siblings, of lovers being separated from one another, of dehumanization and hunger, she daily spun beautiful indigos and roses and ochres and eggplants and mosses and tomato-colored wools into yarn. And she knit that yarn into shawls, and she gave those shawls to her loved ones. Having a practice of beauty did not erase the rage or the weeping or the utter heart-rending devastation of reading what one's ancestors went through, of reading of what human beings are capable of. But it helped her survive. Try to praise the mutilated world, wrote Polish poet Adam Zagajewski. Try to praise the mutilated world. He grew up in post-war ruins, is what he said in Poland. And he says that as a child, he would go with his father on hikes through the mountains in Poland. Once, he says, when they were in the lower Beskids, you would occasionally pass through Ukrainian villages populated by people who had been resettled. And what remained was heartbreaking, he said. What remained was tumbled-down houses and rampant orchards that had remained unpruned and untended. The fruit they bore was probably no longer as good, but it was gigantic, he said. And it was beautiful. And it was untrammeled and rampant, and it was no longer restrained by any human hand. And there were nettles growing everywhere because when people move out, those villages become covered in nettles. He remembers going through one of those villages when he was 17, and then returning when he was a much older man, and sitting in one of those orchards, still untouched by human hands, decades later, and writing the poem, "You Must Try to Praise the Mutilated World." James Baldwin, who we have been talking a lot about in these past few weeks of services. Actually, where did it go? James Baldwin often speaks about love. He's sort of an expert on love. And when an interviewer once asked him, "Do you still feel despair about the world?" He said, "Well, I never really felt despair. I felt enraged, but not despair, because I couldn't tell my niece, I couldn't tell my nephew, you can't tell the children that there's no hope. I felt enraged. But you can't tell the children that there's no hope." And so, my friends, this is what I invite of you this week. Whichever extreme of emotional experience is difficult for you to be in, to operate in, to lean into, I invite you to seek a way to lean into it this week. And particularly if you are finding trouble leaning into the horrors of life, I invite you to do it anyway, but pair it with a practice of beauty. Maybe that's spinning for you as well. Maybe that's just witnessing nature. Maybe that's witnessing a loved one. Maybe it's drinking a root beer float. We are called to not look away. We are called to dig deep in our own lives because, my friends, the gift of digging deep is that we can experience the heights as well. May each one of you find that in this week. May it be so, and amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abby Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abby just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.